Walking down the corridor, Simon felt very tired, as did the plant, which turned out to be more resilient than expected. Simon sank down in his chair and sighed heavily, then rested his forehead against the desk. He wondered why all the classes at the academy were so difficult. The blonde guy who sat down at his table said that it was because he was the first special admissions. Simon asked in confusion what that had to do with his classes being so hard. The guy explained that at Kizen there was tough competition not only among students, but also among professors. Incompetent professors could be fired even in the middle of a semester, and there were cases when the monthly salary suddenly changed. But those who show great results have great influence in the academy. Simon asked what he was getting at. The guy continued, saying that it was because of the competition that all the professors were trying to recruit good students, and now they just had to turn on their brains and think about what would happen if there was a student who was rated as the most talented. It finally dawned on the boy that the professor had called him in front of the class to test his skills. Confirming Simon's speculation, the blonde-haired guy also mentioned about the girl who was called his colleague. Even though it was hard for Simon to think in his condition, he could still remember that her name was Malin Willen. The boy said that Simon was right, adding that she was the best in the whole course, so it was easy to see how good he was compared to her. But that didn't cheer Simon up one bit, since he'd never been able to beat her, and even Hector could barely cast a single spell. The light-haired boy replied that that was why all the professors were confused, because they expected him to be a genius, but in fact he turned out to be a novice. After understanding the explanation, Simon turned to the guy and thanked him, and then with a nonchalant face asked for his name. This question made the blonde-haired boy resentful, as he couldn't understand how Simon couldn't remember his name, which he had told him during Professor Bahil's class. Then he added loudly that his name was Dick Hayward, and that he was in the same class as Simon. Standing up from the table, Dick asked Simon about the talk that was going on about him. Realizing what he was talking about, the protagonist replied that they were probably talking about the fact that he was probably not so special anymore. Dick laughed and replied that he shouldn't take it to heart, because it was normal to be himself, and he also didn't understand what all the fuss was about on the first day. Then he noted that even though it was only noon, Simon looked exhausted. He grinned and replied that it was because he had used up all his stamina in Professor Bahil's class. Remembering that his new friend had gotten 10 curses at a time, Dick agreed that it was probably normal to be exhausted after that. It was fun, though. This phrase shocked the blonde-haired boy, who stared at Simon in surprise. The same one glowing with joy said that although it was a bit difficult, the class itself was fun. Leaning over to Simon, who was looking at him in bewilderment, Dick wagged his finger at him, saying that he was strange because it couldn't be fun, then added that that wasn't their main problem right now. Then whispered that Hector had already started forming his clique. Not understanding anything, Simon asked what he was talking about. Dick pointed to Hector, who was being introduced by a boy, and explained that he had impressed a lot of the guys in Professor Bahil's class, so it wasn't surprising that there was a lot of excitement about him. He was also the eldest son of an influential family, which made him popular among the noble children. But all this information did not interest Simon, who indifferently replied that he was not interested. But Dick was not going to be so easy to ask, and approaching Simon he said emotionally that politics was also important. Then he asked Simon if he knew what would happen if the whole class fell under Hector's influence. Those who would lose their favor with him would be outcasts, as well as unable to find team members for the group. Realizing that Dick was well versed in politics, Simon asked him why he had come to him and not to Hector. He scratched the back of his head and replied that he was a commoner from a merchant family. Simon was surprised, for he had heard that everyone was treated equally at Kizen. Dick grinned and replied that it was true. But unfortunately there were still some children from noble families who wanted to show their superiority. Hearing this, Simon replied that at least he was not, which pleased Dick, who was about to offer him something. "Join my group, Simon," said Dick enthusiastically, pointing a finger at himself. Then he assured Simon that whether you lacked skills or were told you had them, he was special admission number 1. In addition, kids who took the prep courses might seem better in class now, but with time, if you worked hard, things would even out. And there was no way Nephthys would pick him for nothing. Then, pointing his finger at Simon, Dick said excitedly that, to put it another way, he was hiding talents that even he didn't know he had. There was an awkward pause. After which Simon replied with a laugh. That he couldn't say anything about joining his band yet. But smiling and holding out his hand to Dick, Simon suggested that they start with friendship. The offer seemed to surprise the boy. He waved his hands and said that in Kizen it was a very awkward word that was rarely heard, adding that it sounded cringeworthy. But seeing that Simon was serious and not even joking, he scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Then, holding out his hand in return, Dick replied that it would be nice to have a friend, and Simon agreed. Dick said that they would soon be leaving again for the next C class. Simon agreed and asked what the next class would be. Dick looked at the schedule and said that it was summonology. This news made Simon very happy, which made him glow with happiness. For now he could summon creatures on his own, just as his father had done. Hopefully, he and Dick headed to the next class. As Simon climbed the stairs in search of empty seats, he heard conversations that mocked him, calling him the biggest failure in Kizen's history. Hector's jackal sitting next to him mockingly mentioned that he was also said to be better than Cerna, Châtel, and Lorraine, mockingly adding that it was bullshit. Hector just stared at Simon in silence, not saying a word. Dick sat down next to Simon and told him not to pay attention to them, because they just wanted to assert themselves at the expense of others. But the protagonist did not care. His only desire and the object of all his attention was the draft class, and all he did was to stare at one point with the look of a fool in love, waiting for the class to begin. Watching this, Dick could not help noting that his new friend was rather strange. Suddenly footsteps were heard in the corridor. At the same time Simon could not understand why his friend called him strange, for no one had ever said such things to him before, to which he replied that from now on he would hear part of it. At the same time a man came into the hall yawning. His appearance did not match the professor's, and the students began to whisper, wondering who it could be. The man walked to the table and put his hands on it. Then raised his head and introduced himself as Arandia, their recruitment teacher for this semester. Then without changing his tone he began his lecture, beginning by saying that summonology was the root of all necromancers, as well as their history. Starting to write something in chalk on the blackboard, he continued, telling the bewildered students that even though the scholars did not recognize it, that necromancers were descended from thieves of Thrun, gravediggers, and other similar occupations. Pointing behind him to the blackboard where the single word summonology was written in chalk, he continued, saying that if the students had ears, they had probably heard many stories about summonology. Lagging behind the times, badly treated, hard to learn, lots of flaws and nuances, he said. Exactly the kind of prejudices you might have heard towards necromancers, said Professor Aaron. However, most of them are true, he added, contrary to all the expectations of the students who were shocked by his words, to the last hoping that he would say that they were all just rumors. However, the reality turned out to be cruel. A murmur went through the class, as the students did not understand how the professor of the draft could say such things. However, the professor, who looked more like a common warrior than a teacher, went on to say that they must have enjoyed all the previous classes, as the professors had only told them the delights of their specialty. However, he said he didn't support that attitude, adding that he thought everyone should know both the pros and cons of a specialization in order to make the right decision. Therefore, he started with the disadvantages, which surprised the students who had encountered it for the first time. The first disadvantage was that it was expensive, and no matter how much you calculate it, it still comes out to be several times more costly. The materials fee for conscription can be several times more than for all other specialties combined. This price for materials is due to the fact that suitable materials were not very common, but that was no reason to kill people or animals to get materials. Therefore, in modern times, summoners use skeleton kits or specially processed corpses for summoning. He went on to explain that most often summoners spent more money on materials than they received in reward for the mission, so he advised students who were going to study summonology not to expect to earn money. And the second drawback was that the summoner depended heavily on summoned creatures, because if you think about it, summonology is all about battles with summoned creatures. But when the summoner's creatures are destroyed, the summoner's power is drastically reduced by more than 80%. Part of the problem was the first drawback, but these days summoners are more likely to use a semi-permanent remade undead rather than a disposable one. If they lose these semi-permanent undead, they suffer both strategic and financial damage. Until they rebuild their summoned creature or replace it with a new one, they can only watch from the sidelines as their counterparts fight. The third and most important disadvantage was that the summoners were weak against the priests, to be precise. Summonology was no match for modern howling, and that was no joke. The time when summonology could fully realize its potential was total war, as during battles summoners get an unlimited supply of materials for summoning undead, because dead bodies could be found literally everywhere. But even after the truce, modern warfare continues in the form of small localized battles. And for such quick and traceless battles best suited mages who specialized in curses, as well as spirit controllers. While necromancy was very weak against priests, who could destroy the entire army with a single holy spell, which was very inefficient, as the cost of recovery would be enormous. After telling the disadvantages, the professor added that there were a few more, but in any case the choice was left to the students. As soon as he finished, Jamie immediately raised her hand, calling out to the professor. Having introduced herself, she asked with interest, "So what were the advantages of summonology?" The professor looked at the girl with a frown. He replied that he didn't remember allowing her to ask questions, which took the girl by surprise, and she confusedly sat down and apologized. Advantages. The number as well as the possibility of applying different tactics in battle using summoned creatures, without enthusiasm in his voice replied the professor, which sounded like he was omitting too many advantages, and in general was not interested to interest the students. Without naming more advantages, he turned to the students and said that only they should decide whether to take summonology in the second semester or not, but added that they should not forget one thing. Don't even dream of setting foot in this field if you don't have the guts for it. After this motivational speech, the professor added that if anyone is going to cry, whine, turn away or consult him about changing their major after the second year for financial reasons or whatever, they shouldn't even consider majoring in that field with such a characterless mindset. As the students listened to his words, they looked at him in confusion. The assistants, who had already listened to these words apparently not for the first time, sighed tiredly. The professor did not stop, saying that if someone hopes to specialize in summonology only because there is less competition for survival, I will personally expel you. Okay, that's it, let's get to class. To which the class tentatively agreed. Simon picked up a box with unknown contents, which was provided by his assistants, and listened to the professor's instructions, who explained that these boxes contained the bones of sharp-blooded rat catchers. Opening the lid, the guy saw a lot of different bones that were signed and sorted into compartments. The choice towards rat bones was justified by the similarity to human body structure, making it cheaper and easier than normal human skeletons. Tossing one of the skulls into the air with his hand, the instructor explained that most beginning summoners start with island rat bones. Pointing to a poster that the assistant was trying to hang on the wall at the time, he explained that it was the Pied Piper's bone structure. Then deciding to start practicing, he ordered everyone to pull out skull number 1. Adding for them the skull was already assembled by default. One of the girls took the skull in her hands and remarked that it was quite creepy, to which the other girl replied that despite that it was very clean. Seeing that most of the students had already examined the skulls, the professor told the students to put their hand through the hole that was located right under the skull. There should be a magical corrective circle inside. He added that it was exactly where they should put their hand and activate the magic circle. Simon held the skull in his hands and followed the professor's commands. Soon the boy managed to find the hole where the magic circle was located, which was supposed to work as a corrector, and then he stretched out his hand, deciding to try. Once the magic circle is complete. But he didn't have time to finish, as the next moment there were squeals and frightened screams from the students around the classroom, who, without listening to the end, activated the circles, causing the heads of the island rat catchers to come to life and start wreaking havoc around the classroom. While the students, obviously unprepared for such a turn, were frightened, not realizing what was going on. The professor smirked as if he hadn't seen this coming and said that he was going to tell them not to be frightened by the fact that the undead would come back to life after the activation. But unfortunately he was too late, to which there were angry voices from the class saying that it was rather cruel and low. Simon, who had also activated the skull, ordered him not to move, which he immediately did. Seeing that Simon had been able to calm the skull so quickly, and that he was treating it as something ordinary, Dick asked if he had ever experienced such things before. To which Simon replied that he'd just seen them a lot before. With a loud clap on the table to attract attention, the professor told the students to get used to it, as they were necromancers, and then added that once the magic circle was activated, the process of creating undead could be considered complete. Since the head couldn't move on its own, it needed to create a body, and for that, necromancers needed to be familiar with the bone structure of the summoned creature. Unlike the human body which had 206 bones, the body of the island ratcatcher only had 53 bones, which was much simpler. Following the instructions of the professor, who said to take the number 2 neck bone and connect it to the skull, Simon found the right bone and began to carefully bring it to the skull. Suddenly the bone, like a magnet, jumped out of the guy's hand and stuck to the skull. The professor explained that skeletons have a tendency to return to their original form, and therefore, if you follow certain rules, the assembly should not be difficult, to which Simon replied in surprise that it was, while the skull of Dick, who decided that the head of his summoner was not necessary, tried to correct this misunderstanding. The professor continued to explain what to do, saying that now they should move on to bones number 3, 4, and so on up to 11. The students, despite the fact that it was not the easiest thing to do, followed his instructions with interest, and also consulted with each other. But not everyone had a good time, because some of them, before hearing the professor's warning to be careful not to mix up the bones of the upper back with the lower bones, which was very important, had already made this mistake, which again led to incidents with rodents, which, out of control, began to attack the innocent neighbors of those who had managed to mix up the bones. The professor said that if the creature is assembled incorrectly, it will not move smoothly. And in some cases it could break in the most important places at the most crucial moment. Hector folded his arms on his chest without showing any emotion, sitting in front of his perfectly assembled undead, while his minions sucked up to him praising him and telling him that he was the best. While the rest of the students following the professor's instructions were at 16 dice, Malin finished assembling her undead and sat with a bored look. Soon most of the students were able to get to bone 53, which was almost the end. The professor told the students not to be silent and to raise their hand if they were stuck somewhere and didn't know what to do. Immediately after his words, several students raised their hands to say that they were not doing well. At the same time he finished his first skeleton, which he had created with the help of his darkness. Simon smiled contentedly at his creation as he heard the voice of his new friend calling helplessly for him. Pointing to his undead, which was sitting on the table in a strange pose, Dick tearfully asked Simon why his skeleton was always trying to put a leg bone in his hand. After a glimpse of the undead, Simon pointed to the shoulder joint, adding that he had probably placed the leg bone where the arm bone should have been, which made the summoned creature move so strangely. Dick looked at his undead more closely and was surprised to see that Simon was right, then grumbled about why the bones were so similar. After a while, Professor Aaron announced that the time for collecting skeletons had been exhausted, adding that there would now be a demonstration of what they had gone through in class. As expected, he called Simon first, who had already accepted his fate and nodded obediently. Dick patted him on the back and wished him luck. The next student to be called by the teacher was Hector Moore. Hector Moore, whom he also summoned to come to the front of the class. Once again standing opposite each other and keeping their eyes on each other, they listened attentively to the teacher, who informed them that they had 10 minutes until the end of the class. Then he began to explain the essence of the competition, which was to collect the skeleton of his undead and using it to get a necklace. The winner will be the one who at the end of the class and will have a necklace. He also said that they could not take it with their hands and use dark magic, except for these 2 rules everything else was allowed. After the professor finished explaining the rules he told the guys to get ready and start as soon as he gave the command, after which they immediately knelt down and opened the box of bones. As soon as Professor Aaron gave the sign, the boys immediately grabbed a skull each of their future summoned creatures. Holding